Louie T. Welcome to the command post. You know what it is. Post up. Take command. I, of course, am your commander-in-chief, Louie T. Thank you for joining me. I'm dressed in all black like the Omen, which means one of two things. Either we took one on the chin or I am the bearer of bad news. And last time I checked, the NFL doesn't play games in April. So that means I'm the bearer of bad news. So you kind of got the feeling that there had to be a parting shot or two from Daniel Snyder on the way out with his black cloud of doom over this franchise. So there's maybe one or two more blessings before he leaves. This may be the last one. I'm hoping it's the last one. But the NFL cracked down on some sort of gambling scandal. I mean, how big could it be? I don't know. We still don't even really know what Calvin Ridley was doing when he bet on the NFL. We just know he got suspended for an entire year. Anyway, 5 players have been suspended by the NFL for this gambling scandal. 4 of them were Detroit Lions. One of them, which is the reason I'm here, was a Washington Commander. You may know him. His name is Shaka Toney. Shaka Toney. And so, because the NFL discovered this gambling scandal, these players have been suspended. Now, 2 of the 5 were suspended 6 games, including former first-round pick. He was a first-round pick for the Lions last year, and they're really counting on him to be their number 1 wide receiver, Jameson Williams. He's suspended 6 games along with a fellow wide receiver. I think his name is Berryhill. Okay, those guys got 6 games. So their involvement was probably minimal. It was probably a little bit less than the other 3 who have all been suspended indefinitely. Shaka Toney being one of those players suspended indefinitely. Indefinitely usually means a year without any equivocations, right? There's no appealing, none of that. You're suspended until we say you're not suspended. So you can reapply after a year, but you could still remain suspended after that time frame. So for all intents and purposes, if you're not a bona fide stud or we don't see high level potential in you, something like this, I'm washing my hands clean and I'm done with you. The Lions have already cut the 2 guys that they've deemed expendable, okay? The 2 guys that got suspended 6 games, obviously they're not cutting Jameson Williams, but the other receiver got 6 games. They're holding on to those 2 for now. Well, they're holding on to Jameson Williams, period. But the other receiver, they're holding on to him as well. All right. The other 2 have already been released. Okay. Quintez Cephas and CJ Moore. They're already gone. Okay. And this is probably a death sentence for Shaka Toney on this roster. Look, I was already trying to replace him. Remember, when I put out my 7-round mock draft, I had Washington taking Mohamed Diabate late in the draft in the 6th round as a way to push a guy like Shaka Toney at the back end of the roster, potentially off of the roster altogether. So I was already forward thinking with a guy like Shaka Toney, seeing more value in a young player like, Mohamed Diabate. Again, I don't know if Washington's going to do something like that. Maybe this necessitates that. Maybe this precipitates that. I don't want to overblow this situation. It's not like Shaka Toney was a massive contributor on this football team. He's very replaceable, okay? Was not really in the defensive end rotation. It's probably going to be 5 guys this year. And the only reason he even made the team last year was because of Chase Young's situation and him being injured. I'd like to think that with F.A. Obata being back, you got, Chase Young. And again, assuming nothing happens, no one gets traded, nothing happens between now and the start of camp. All 5 of those guys are still there, being F.A. Obata, Chase Young, Montez Sweat, James Smith-Williams, and Casey Toohill. There's no space on the roster for a guy like Shaka Toney anyway. So this is not a big deal, honestly. But it is for a guy like Shaka Toney, who was barely hanging on to an NFL roster. Now you're suspended for a year. You put yourself in a pretty rough spot. And if Washington sees fit, which I don't see why they wouldn't, they could just cut ties with him. They don't want to be associated with anything negative. When they start having this story run, it could easily say former Washington Commander, right? They can distance themselves from him if they so choose. it'll be interesting to see what they decide to do, especially this close to the draft. It's easy for them to turn and pivot and say, you know what? Let's go ahead and move on from Shaka. Let's take a guy in the 6th round. We got 2 6th-round picks. Let's take a guy that looks like Shaka Toney, moves like Shaka Toney, can play special teams like Shaka Toney, and give us some pass rushing juice off the edge. Let's take a guy and let's get rid of Shaka Toney. It's very plausible that they turn, pivot, and do that late in the draft. Now, even if they weren't thinking that way, maybe they do that now. I was already thinking that way anyway, which is why, again, I had Washington taking Mohamed Diabate late in the draft. So I think what Shaka Toney has effectively done is he's put his NFL career in jeopardy. I don't understand these young boys. I don't even know the significance to what was done here. I don't even know if it was even worth it. I hope it was worth it. Whatever it was, it could have been something very minuscule, something stupid and frivolous. It doesn't matter. Apparently, Shaka Toney's a gambling man, and he's gambling with his career in his hand. God damn, I don't understand these young boys. They just don't learn. You had a great example put in front of you last year. The league made an example out of wide receiver. What's my man's name from Jacksonville? Calvin Ridley's ass last year. Made an example out of Calvin Ridley's ass. And you had that front and center. And you're going to go and do something foolish? I just don't get it. But again, I hope it was worth it. Whatever it was. Because now if you're Shaka Toney, I hope you got a degree from Penn State. If not, now's the time to go back and finish up. Because more likely than not, you might have just brought your NFL career to a screeching halt. 1 year can do that for a guy that was barely hanging on to begin with. 1 year could put you out of sight, out of mind. Now's the time to go finish up that degree, my man, if you haven't already done so. If you did, start looking for some jobs and start start fixing up that resume. And maybe start preparing for life after football. I'm not saying, I'm just saying. Anyway, again, I wasn't looking to keep you here very long because, again, Shaka Toney, while he was a guy that we were excited about as a 7th rounder a couple of years ago, he hasn't really made a mark on his football team. A lot of you wanted him to make a switch to linebacker. I told you guys, don't think that's happening. And I was excited because he offered a little juice off the edge, but we've seen flashes, but not nearly enough. And he's gotten in games, and he's had opportunities and situations to get after the quarterback, and he hasn't done it. I don't even think he has an NFL sack to his name. I'd be shocked if he even had, a pressure or two. We've seen it in the preseason. I don't know if we've seen it in a regular season game. Maybe he does have a sack. Maybe he does have 1 or 2 pressures in an NFL game, but he's been disappointing for me as a pass rusher. And so at the end of the day, this is not a massive blow to the Washington Commanders, but it is a disappointing one. It is a disappointing one. You never want to see one of your own be wrapped up and caught up in something like this. But, sometimes these young boys, my wife, it was funny how I found out. My wife, she said, oh, my God, when are these young boys going to learn? And she's, rattling off, some of these Detroit Lion players. I'm like, Jameson Williams, what? Their former first-round pick from last year, the receiver? She's like, yeah. I'm like, all right. So I stopped what I'm doing, and I'm like, let me just read this article real quick, with all this information. And then as I'm reading the article, I see Washington Commanders, defensive end Shaka Toney also suspended. I'm like, wait a minute. You didn't tell me there was a commander in here. She's like, I didn't even know. So I don't understand. And I was trying to find the correlation, and, none of them went to the same school. The Berry Hill kid went to Arizona. Jameson Williams started his career at Ohio State. Then he ended up at Alabama. Quintez Cephas went to Wisconsin. Shaka Toney went to Penn State. And C.J. Moore went to Ole Miss. So I don't. There's no correlation here, but it could have easily been as simple as these two of these dudes grew up together, and then they knew somebody else through AAU circuit, or working out at one of these facilities in the off season where these guys train, and they linked up, and so it could have been something as simple as that, because it's kind of weird. The four players on the same team make sense. Shaka Toney doesn't play on the Detroit Lions last time I checked, so he is kind of the oddball here in this mix. So I'm kind of wondering, how is he connected? How did he find himself wrapped up with four players from one team, and he's separated on a whole nother team, and he gets caught up in this? So I want to know, is this some type of a scheme where, you don't have to necessarily know someone, somebody's doing something and they got caught up in it? Or he knew one of those players or a couple of those dudes, and that's how he ended up getting involved. It doesn't matter at this point. He got slapped on the wrist just like the rest of them, and he was one of the ones that really got slapped on the wrist hard. Jameson Williams that's a no-no, and Barry Hill that's a no-no, and the other three dudes, they got smack, trying to break your wrist, smacks, and so yeah, I'd be shocked if Shaka Toney survives this one. I think his career might be coming to a screeching halt because of this. But again, Washington can turn and pivot very easily. I mean, they could do nothing about it because he probably wasn't going to make the team anyway, to be honest with you. Or they could decide to draft a guy late to compete for that roster spot that may or may not be available come the end of training camp. So anyway, I digress. That's going to do it for me, your man Louie T, here with this quick Washington Commanders update. My goodness. Shaka Toney, a gambling man. Who would have knew? Who would have thought, right? Who knew? Anyway, I digress. I'll see you guys a little bit later on down the line, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, one of those days. Enjoy your weekend. Hopefully nothing else comes out negative about our team or any of its players. They're not going to rain on our parade. We waiting for Dan and company to finalize this thing and so we can wipe the slate clean and not have any more of these situations rear its ugly head. But this is probably Dan with, one or two final shots at us before he exits stage left. He needs to hurry up and carry his ass. That's what this means. So I digress. You guys get out of here. You know what it is. Post up. Take command. I'll see you guys next time for the Command Post. Have a good one. Enjoy your weekend.
LouieTeeNetwork.